use Makaton or Sign Along, which is a simplified version of British Sign Language. Gesturing, body language, writing, we said that one, reading, watching, listening, acting, good one, miming, and email, which many of you said. So they're just some of the forms of communication that we use day to day. Usually we use a mixture of all of these, don't we? Or just about. So communication, a definition. So who do we mean? Who has a communication difficulty or need? Who are we meaning by this? So they could have a difficulty with speech, with grammar, with an understanding of the meaning of words, the use of language and comprehension. However, a brief note, just to emphasise this, although people with English as a second language, or specifically a child who comes to your school with no English, although they do have a communication and interaction difficulty, this is only because of the language, isn't it? And that is going to be broken down as soon as they start to learn English. Apologies to anybody who is hearing a phone connection during this. We don't know how to turn it off. Sorry, so please ignore it. Anyway, so although, as I was saying, English as a second language, or those who don't have English at the moment when they arrive at our schools, do have a communication difficulty, it is only a temporary one, isn't it? So who we're really talking about, for the most part, are those who have a learning difficulty. All right. So this is some of the instances that might cause a young person or a child, or an adult for that matter, to have a communication interaction difficulty. So it could be that they have a hearing impairment, so they could be partially hearing. They could have temporary hearing loss, or they could have sometimes children have blue ear. Sorry, I'm not going to move my arms, but I've just realised that's very annoying. Keep my hands closed. So they could have blue ear, which is temporary. They could have partial hearing, complete deafness. They could have a cochlear implant, hearing aids, etc. So hearing impairment can cover very mild hearing loss to quite severe hearing loss, to total hearing loss actually. Also with visual impairment. Children with ADHD, although you might think the opposite, that they communicate too much because of at times the rate they can talk, their ability to communicate and interact can be a difficulty because the brain is working so fast. Those with ASD, or on that spectrum, autistic or Asperger's, GLD or MLD, you may have come across those two terms, global learning difficulties or moderate to mild learning difficulties. Children, young people with these often have some form of communication difficulty. And dyslexia. Dyslexia can come in many forms. It can be just the written language that's a problem. It can be written, numeracy, and speech. So it can have all different forms of dyslexia causing communication difficulties. Emotional and behavioural difficulties, cleft palate and glue ear. And as we said about the glue ear earlier, although it's a temporary one, or can be a temporary one, and the cleft palate as well, because they could have surgery to correct it, it's still, for the time that they have that condition, it's still a communication and interaction difficulty that needs to be addressed. So, how do we support these young people, students with learning difficulties, communication? So we want to help them to acquire and comprehend language properly, don't we? That's the key thing to help them articulate language properly. It might be that we use alternative methods to do this, augmented means of communication. Some of you might not have come across that term before. Augmented means of communication is really, or assisted communication, it's where communication is help. So, for instance, you all know Stephen Hawking. There's a film out about his life at the moment. He uses a computer, doesn't he, as his voice. That's an augmented means of communication. It's a system that's set up to work with his brain to help him communicate. There are many other forms. I'm going to come on to one of them in a little while, called a Book of Objects of Reference, which is a very good system that we use in special education to assist children with communication. I'll come back to that later, so I'm not any more about that now. So we want to use a variety of different, or try at least a variety of different means of communication to be able to help that child communicate. We want to help them acquire literacy skills. We want to help organise and coordinate oral and written language. So these are all our aims by supporting those with communication. So these are the key elements of communication, okay? So this is a little bit of theory for you. So it's broken into three. So form or grammar. Then it goes to content, the vocabulary that we use, the kind of basis. Sorry, I'm doing this with a hand again. The basis, and that's my form of communication, isn't it? Using my hands all the time, gestures. Using vocabulary to build sentences, to build words, and to develop ideas. And then the use, how to use language correctly, the rules of conversation, for example, such as taking turns, saying please, thank you in the correct places. All these things have to be developed, and these are the three key elements for developing communication. We have to have a pattern in which they're acquired. So we have to help that child or that young person develop methods which will help the patterns develop. It won't just happen naturally, which is why they have communication difficulty. It's always hierarchical. So you need to have reached one point of development before you can move on to another. So it's, if you imagine, it's like a block, like Lego. So you have the first block, and then you add the second one, and it's not until that second block is securely, firmly positioned, and as you build up that tower, will the child be able to move on to the next stage of development of communication. So you're building blocks like a Lego tower, if you imagine, and each one has to be secured before we can move on to the next. So we're taking it in very small, steady stages. We all have to obviously work together for successful communication. So you might be working as part of a team. There might be yourself, the teacher, there could be another teaching assistant. In some instances, although they are a rare breed these days in Norfolk, speech and language therapists. If you've got access to one of them, that's marvellous, but don't count on it. But all of these people have to work together for the best outcomes for that child. And all moved through the different ways to reach the individual, to teach. So each individual must be treated as a separate person. So it's not one size fits all. So because certain strategies worked with little Billy last year, you cannot assume that these same strategies are going to work with Jane this year, because they're very different people. And even if it's the same learning difficulty they have, they will react or may react in a different way. So you have to treat every child as an individual. So examples of receptive communication. So we've got a little, where's my app? Here it is. So this is the way it develops, the stages of development. So firstly, we have to have the pupils or the children listen to and attend and follow short stories. We're using reading as an illustration here. Short stretches of time. So the key is short. I've made that bold. So emphasize that. I cannot emphasize that enough. I think we're talking about initially no more than 10 minutes at a time. So short stretches of time. And then you might give the child 4 key words. So, for example, you could have been working with the child with a book. For the example I have here is a book about dinosaurs. So what are your 4 key words that you're trying to teach this child initially before you even get inside the story of the book? So you've got I've underlined the 4 keywords here. So it's get, big book, dinosaurs. So you're asking the child to get the big book about the dinosaurs from the library, but you're not going to say all of that, are you? Because that's going to confuse the child and you're giving them too much information to try and process. So you're slowing it down and you're simplifying it and you're taking out unnecessary words. Words like the, about. Another word that's not necessary is and. Interestingly, in British Sign Language, there is no sign for and. So it's not necessary. It's an extra. It's an add-on, and we don't need that. We want to teach the key factors to these children to help them be able to process communication in a simple format that's going to work for them. So giving them extra flowery vocabulary is unnecessary. So that's where you're starting at. But you must remember to keep it to these 4 keywords. And then, for instance, you might be moving on to reading the story. So there's, for example, I've used a boy here. So you might say, where has the boy gone? Again, is the necessary? No, it's not necessary. Where has boy gone? That's all you need. So you could have visual, you've got the book in front of you usually by this stage, so you can use visual symbols as well to assist you. But you're doing away with unnecessary language. Okay. Keeping it to those 4 key words is the best way of being able to get through to these children and to help them develop their receptive skills to be able to communicate better, be it through reading, be it through verbal communication, or if you're using sign language, exactly the same thing will work with sign. Or you could use pictures. You don't have to use actual words. It could be pictures, or it might not be speech. As I said, it could be sign that you're doing it with. So breaking it down. Go. So the form, remember, is your 4 key words, no more. And make sure that they are the key words. And then you understand that the question has been understood or the request has been understood. So you make sure that that child that you're working with, so going back to my example of asking the boy to get the book from the library, does he know where the library is? Is there any way of helping him to know where the library is? Make sure that he knows what you want him to do and you keep that request to a maximum of 4 keywords. Just the form, and then the content. Your vocabulary should be simple and clear and use a mixture of visual clues. So you could have a picture of the library, you could have some visual symbols. So in your schools you'll have lots of visual and you'll have ideas of how you would do that. You might have a mixture of signs that you and the child have developed together or visual pictures. So that's the content. And then the use. So using it in the correct way. So practicing listening and taking turns and following the story. Again, I should have underlined this, for short stretches of time. And as I said in the previous slide, initially you're not going to do this any more than 10 minutes at a time because you'll have lost the child and it's just far too long for them to concentrate. Although this seems very simple to us, it's actually quite hard when you remember that you're working with children who have got gaps in their ability to link together communication. So you're breaking it down into very, very small chunks. And a little star. Yay. Okay, clarity. Now we're talking about ourselves here. Do not get lost in translation, or don't allow ourselves to be lost in translation. And for some reason, the end of translation has disappeared. It says transl. Anyway, there we go. Translation. So clarity, how? How can we ensure that we are clear? So simple terms, using simple terms and keeping our instructions logical and clear, and direct questioning. Clarify, inform, and if you don't understand, ask questions, double check, ask for examples. Now this is a two-way thing. This is not just us to the child, this is the child to us. So if you're asking the child questions to clarify, obviously you're going to keep those questions very simple. Don't over confuse them by adding again, there's too many flowery words. But don't be afraid to clarify and double check things. So this is what lack of clarity can do. Cause confusion. Definitely, yeah. Cause absolute confusion. And then in the instance of children with learning difficulties, not only does that confusion cause you upset in your lesson, it will cause frustration in them, and that frustration can lead to behaviour issues, and the child just not wanting to do any more, and then you've lost them, and you've got your way back to stage one again, and you've got to start from the beginning. Unnecessary stress, which is the confusion, isn't it? And that stress, it's a vicious circle, can cause unnecessary behaviour and cause the child to just lose focus, etc. Make errors, it can make the child nervous, it can make them make unnecessary errors. And then you can end up wasting more time, spending time clarifying, than you did on the actual lesson. So being clear and making sure you're clear in what you want to convey before you actually take that child out to do the work with them will save you time in the long run. So a little bit of preparation time will save you a lot of time in the long run. So I would like you to think about this little scenario for a minute, and I'm going to give you some discussion time to type some responses in the chat box here, because I've talked quite a bit here. So I'd like you to think about if you were working with someone who had a hearing impairment. So for example, you've got little Johnny who's in your class, and he has 2 hearing aids and a cochlear implant. So he has virtually no hearing whatsoever, but he can pick up some low sounds. How would you explain to him where Norfolk is in relation to the rest of the United Kingdom? What types of communication would be successful and what would not work? Okay, have a go, see what you come up with. I'd like to see you typing some things in. All right, so I'm going to give you 5 minutes to come up with some successful communication methods. How would you, as a teaching assistant, try to explain to a deaf child where Norfolk is in relation to the rest of the United Kingdom? We've got a picture of a cow, just to show you that we are in Norfolk. There you go, on you go. Michelle has put up her hand. Oh, props as well. Yeah. David has said, write it down. Michelle, I'm sorry, you put your hand up, but I haven't quite worked out how to just put it down now. So if you could just pop your question in here, I'll get back to you. All right. Okay, how did you get on? So what methods did we come up with? Sign, Michelle said sign, very good. Kay Miles has said lots of physical pointing and nodding. It would be good to use yes, good to use a pen. Kath, well done, Kath. Pictures and maps. Pictures and maps. So in other words, you're going to use visual communication, aren't you? It's all going to be visual. There is no point in trying to explain to a hard of hearing child, oh, Norfolk is, you know that ear bit at the side of Britain? That's where Norfolk is, right out there. There's no, you could explain that to your blue in the face, but deaf people tend to be very visual. They see the world in pictures. It's like their one sense is overcompensating for the other. So people who tend to be deafer are much more likely to be very visual people. So pictures, maps, keywords, it might be useful, as someone has said, to use keywords like make sure that they know what you mean by Norfolk, make sure they know what the UK is. So you might have a map of the United Kingdom, and do they know where that is? Could they identify the separate countries within that, and then narrow it down, narrow it down. But the key is, as most of you have said, it's going to be visual, not oral, not related to speech. It's going to be pictorial, and the more pictorial you can make it, the more successful you'll be in communicating to this child. It might be that you explain or show pictures of the various specific things relating to Norfolk, and that might assist them as well. But again, visual. The key is visual. Keep it visual. So, overcoming communication barriers. Firstly, we have to identify clearly what the communication difficulty is. I know that sounds very obvious, but where do you start? That's the thing. And when this child is presented to you, maybe at the start of the year, you're given a new child, you don't know anything about that child, that young person. You've got to go and do your research. You've got to know what is specific difficulties are. There should, if he's already been in the school, then there will be paperwork about him. So you've got to read previous individual learning plans and any documentation that there is about his difficulty. You've got to speak to other teachers who've worked with him, other support staff, and the parents if possible as well, to give yourself as clear a picture as possible. Also useful would be to know what has been used in the past, what methods have the previous staff who worked with this person used, and what was successful and what wasn't, and where they got to with them. And then identify methods for assistance that you have in your school or your college, wherever you have to be. So it could be, for instance, that this child is deaf, for instance, but there could be a deaf loop in the school, or it could be that it was put in and then no one's ever used it and forgot about it, but that system still exists. So that could be useful. In many schools now, particularly primary schools, they have class sets of iPads. These can be really, really useful. I know we're not really touching on EL very much, but they're very helpful with translation if you're working with EL students. Also with deaf students, because they give you that visual contact with them. And with the children with learning difficulties, there's all sorts of programs and assistance out there that can be downloaded onto the iPad, little games and things that can really help assistance with communication. So think about what is available in your school. What do they have? What could you find in the school? Sometimes schools buy things and then forget about them. So have a look, and use what's available to you. And also, don't be afraid to ask. If you haven't got anything that you really need, I'm not saying that you'll always get it, but if you don't ask, you definitely won't get it. So if there's a piece of equipment that you've sourced it and think, this could be really helpful for this child, then ask and see if they can get it for you. Thirdly, think outside of the box. Don't just stick to methods that have worked in the past or not worked in the past, or this is what we've always done, this is how we always work with children with communication difficulties. It's good sometimes to think out the box and try different things, especially when other methods just haven't worked. I mentioned very briefly earlier the objects of communication method, which is a style of augmented communication. And this is one of the methods that I find with children, particularly with moderate learning difficulties or global learning difficulties, or autism, where they might have little or not very clear communication at all, or in the case of autism, might be reluctant to use verbal communication with you at times. And what you do is you create a book with that child or that young person that is specifically about them. So it's all things that are important in their life and in their life in school really specifically. So it might be that your child that you work with always has the same thing for snack time. They always have a banana at snack time. You might then have a photograph of that banana in the book, and then that child learns that when they come to that picture, it's snack time. And over a period of time, you build it up. It could be that you have a specific area in the classroom where lunch boxes are put, and this child you're working with, you're trying to convey to them that they must learn to put their lunchbox in the correct place every day. You have a photograph of the area where all the lunch boxes are put, and maybe a photograph of him with his lunchbox in his hand, putting it in the correct area. And then that child can relate directly to exactly what it is you want to communicate to them. But the key is to do it with the child and do it over a period of time so that every picture in that book relates directly to that child's needs and what it is you want to teach that child to communicate. And it can be done with actual objects as well. It doesn't have to be photographs. In some instances, this can work even better. A number of years ago, I worked with a child, a young person actually, who had no communication whatsoever. He was severely autistic, but he loved to hoover, and we were in an art class, and at the end of the session, imagine we needed to hoover. We had a little Henry Hoover, and he also had behavioural issues. So we wanted to teach this young lad that he could only get to do the hoovering if he behaved appropriately in the class. So we had a box of objects of reference which we'd been gathering, and we managed to source a little toy Henry the Hoover that went in this box. And over a period of time, and we are talking 6 months here, this boy learned that if Henry the Hoover, the toy one that is, was not in his box of objects of reference, he had not behaved appropriately, and he wasn't getting to hoover at the end of the lesson. If Henry the Hoover was still in the box, he could then go and get it, and he knew he behaved appropriately and he got to hoover at the end of the lesson. So it's simple things like that that can really work, and particularly with the more complex and compound needs, having the actual physical objects in a box. We just had a cardboard box, and it was filled with all his things that meant something to him, and it was really, really effective. So, but it's trial and error, trying different things, which is why I say think outside of the box and don't be worried that people think you're mad for trying something that hasn't been tried before, because it just might work. So think about the children that you support. What do you need to consider? Obviously, it's got to be positive, hasn't it? Any support we give them must be positive. It's to bring them on and develop them. So some things to consider. So thinking about the specific difficulties and any other difficulties and influences they may have. And some of those things could be the other children in the class. So you have one child in the class of 30 who has learning difficulties, and he has communication difficulties, and you're trying to get him to be part of that class and to interact with that class. You then also want to get the other children in the class to interact with that child, don't you? You don't want them to be isolated. You want them to be part of things. So it's how you go about this. So it might be, for instance, that you do a little bit of, so if the child uses sign language or some form of signing, it might be that some of the other children are taught some little bits of signing as well, so that they can share in communication with each other. So being aware of the influences and the other children in the class especially is a key. Another thing to consider is medical equipment. I was particularly thinking about children who wear hearing aids and have cochlear implants. It can be very difficult to try and work with this equipment, especially in practical subjects. For instance, PE. It might be that the teachers or the teaching assistants, for that matter, are very nervous of letting that child take part in some physical sports like football. And I did observe a number of years ago where a boy who had a cochlear implant was used as the line judge while the other boys all played football. And this went on every lesson. And I thought, that's not really inclusive, is it? He's not getting the full enjoyment out of that sport. He's getting some part of it, but he's not getting what the others are getting, is he? And so finding a way of making that work for him as well, and not having him on the sidelines. And it is possible. I know it's difficult with equipment because you don't want to get him broken, but you've still got to consider that that child should be included in part of the lesson. So finding ways around it, working with the teachers to make sure that that child is included in those lessons and not segregated in any way. And also other things that happen with hearing aids especially is that they can pick up other noises and they can trouble the child. It can also cause chafing and irritations, and the child can become disturbed by this. So being aware of these things and being aware that just because the child is wearing his hearing aids that everything is fine, it often isn't. So watching for physical signs, watching that he's distressed or things aren't quite working the way they should be with him, and there is maybe something you can do to help that. And also helping them to feel part of things, help them to be finding ways of being included in things like PE where there's physical contact. You want to be careful of the etc. And what is available, what is practical in that school. I'm suggesting that inclusivity is possible for everything, but it isn't always. You do have to be aware of the school circumstances and its inclusivity as much as possible. But what we don't want is segregation. So we don't want that child sitting on the sidelines or being excluded. Or for instance, if it's a music lesson in secondary schools, it might be that the school decides, oh well, that child's deaf, there's no point in there being in a music lesson. You might as well have extra English. But I don't believe that's true. I think a child who is deaf can get as much from a music lesson as a child who is hearing. But it's making sure that we make the steps to make that happen. So, for instance, if the child is deaf, usually they will be able to feel vibrations through the floor. So making sure that music lesson is not in a carpenter's room. It's just a very simple thing. But that can make the difference between that child being included or excluded from a lesson that can bring quite a good deal of enjoyment to their life. It's worth remembering that one of our best percussionists in this country is completely deaf, Ellen Glennie. So she's a musician, professional musician. It's not necessarily to include children from subjects that sometimes are seen as non-essential. Again, looking at previous information about that child, looking at what the teachers have previously documented about them, talking to staff, talking to parents, and looking at an individual learning plan, and then gathering your information to create your individual learning plan that you are going to use to work with that child. I've got an example which I think is a really good example. Hopefully, if I've operated this correctly, it will come up now. Yes, I'm hoping you can see that. So this is a learning plan that was devised by Helston High School to work specifically with their children with English as a foreign language. But you can see that it's really child-centred. It's very colourful, and as I scroll through, it won't let me scroll through. No, it should do. Anyway, if I was able, yes, I can scroll through. There we go. So you can see what the TA who devised this has done is she's given every year group its own colour. So it's full of colour. And then if I stop here, for instance, it's very child-centred. She's got what my aspirations are, so the child's own aspirations. What does he want to be or she want to do when they leave school, for instance? And then a space to put a picture of that there. If it would help me if you. So again, it's specifically addressing the child. So the child is saying, it would help me if you could. And then the child has got a space there to put what they feel would be the best way to help them. And then it's got a bit up here for the teacher to put their notes and how they think the child is progressing. And then it's got their current reading ages and scores, etc. Exam things, what they would need for the exam, so a dictionary, some extra time, etc. And then there's a spot here for any extra information. And then if you go on to the next page, scrolls down, you'll see that this is all to be completed with the TA and the student. So that it's nice and colourful, and they can slot in pictures or cut out pictures and add them in. But it's very, very child-centred, which is the key. So I'm not suggesting that you create your learning plans exactly the same as this. This is just an example to show you a good way of doing it. But the key is, sorry, I'm going to go back. PowerPoint, hopefully, yes, I did, it worked. Sorry, back. So the key is to make sure that your learning plan is child-centred or student-centred. There should be nothing on that learning plan that you create that you would not want that child to read, or for that matter, their parents to read. So avoid jargon, avoid teacher speak or acronyms that are unfamiliar to other people. Write for the person, not about them. So just as I showed you in that example there, you can see that the child themselves is involved in the creating of that learning plan, and everything that's put in it is in a method or a way that's accessible for that child to read and to help them develop their, in that case, to help them develop their English. But that system would work for any learning difficulty. Ensure that it can be clearly understood. Again, making sure that it's child-centred or person-centred will help you ensure that it is easily understood. Smart, make sure that any targets you put on that learning plan are smart. Sorry, I'm just going to clear my throat. Which is specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timed or time-bound. So making sure that anything we put on our learning plans is all of these things. We'll make sure that it's not an airy-fairy document that doesn't mean very much, but it is actually going to work. And inclusive, as we said already. Any teaching approaches should be inclusive. They shouldn't involve segregation. Sorry. So, moving on, talking about our own communication style. This is something that we have to consider, because sometimes we have methods of talking that others don't understand. It might be that we speak very fast. It might be that we speak very quietly. It might be that we have a thick accent. I know that's rich coming from me, but we have to be aware of these things and aware that the person that we're trying to communicate with, in this instance, the children or the young people we support, that they all can understand what we're saying. Okay, so some things to consider. Do we talk too often? Do we have too much to say? Now, thinking back to our little bit of theory when we're teaching children to help them develop communication, if we're talking too often, all we're going to do is completely confuse them and send their brains. So what you have to do is you have to remember those key words. So don't talk too often. Less is more. Sorry. Yep. Are we speaking at an appropriate volume? Are we speaking too loudly? Are we speaking too quietly? Are we able to alternate the volume that we speak at to suit the situation? There are times when we really do need to raise our voice, but there are times when it's really important that we lower our voice right down. And sometimes lowering your voice right down can have more effect, because sometimes it makes people listen even closer. Do we leave enough time for contributions? Is it all about us? Do we do all the talking? Or do we let the young people we're working with have plenty of time to ask us questions and to contribute? Is it a two-way discussion, or is it just us? Are we using the right levels of language? Again, going back to our 4 key words, removing all the flowery language out of the way. It's not necessary. We're trying to help young people and children who have a communication difficulty to learn how to communicate more effectively. So using the right level of language for their age and their stage of development. What phrases do we use? We all have key phrases. Are they appropriate? Are they suitable? Do we adjust them if we're working with lots of different children? Do we adjust them to meet the needs of the various children we work with, or are we stuck in a rut and we're stuck with the same phrases all the time? So think about that. Prompts. Do we use a mixture of prompts? Do we use visual prompts? Do we use noise? Do we use, I know primary schools, to get children's attention, they often have a tambourine, or they use the hand clap, or how effective would that be if you had a deaf child in your class? Not effective at all, would it? Unless they could physically see the tambourine and associated that with, you need their attention now. So thinking about what kind of prompts we use, a mixture of maybe visual and symbols, or visual symbols and hand gestures, etc., might be more appropriate. using a mixture of verbal and non-verbal communication is key. Mixing it up. We use automatically our hands when we communicate. I have found it very difficult to sit with my hands down by my side during this presentation, and it's made me very aware of how much I use my hands when I communicate. So, some ideas. This is just might seem a bit radical to you actually, but I think this is a very good idea when we're thinking about our own communication. We recently had some level 4 teaching assistants go through their qualifications, and we got them all to do a peer assessment as part of their qualification. And everybody who did it found it a really, really interesting thing to do and really helpful, because it made them aware of things that they were doing that they needed to change, and it made them aware of things that their colleagues were doing that were very good and that were very useful that they could take with them into their own practice. So if possible, and I know it's not always possible, but it is a good idea if you possibly can to ask a trusted colleague, could you come and observe me and watch what I'm doing and see if you can see any areas that I could improve. You have to be able to be honest and open and not sensitive about this, because they might say something that you don't like. But if you are able to do it, I promise you, you will find it really helpful. Some schools have teaching classrooms where there is audio or visual, audio or both actually, recording equipment built into the classroom. I know we have to be careful with data protection, etc., and safeguarding, but it might be that a lesson that you're taking part in could be recorded, and then you get the opportunity to watch it back, and that can help you as well to see what you need to change if you do need to change anything, or it might highlight areas that you could improve, especially if you watch it back with another colleague and the two of you can bounce ideas off each other. So that's just a couple of ideas to think about. The other thing I would suggest that you do is, sorry, I forgot what I was going to say there. No, that was it. So talking to your colleagues in general, those who you work with in your school, those who see you, just talking to them and bouncing ideas off of each other. Don't feel that you're on your own. Nobody's on their own. You should have the freedom to be able to talk about different things, about children that you're working with. So don't feel that you're completely on your own, because it's a difficult thing to do. It's difficult, and it's going to take you a long time to be able to make some impact with communicating with young people who have a learning difficulty. But looking at yourself first can be a good starting point. What has worked? What do I do well? And what can I improve? Really useful. Okay, so that has come to the end of our presentation. That's the end of me talking. What I'm going to do is I'm going to whiz through this very quickly. Sorry. I don't know how to do this. So I'm just going to go back to the view and just check that we've gone through everything, and then I'm going to answer some of your questions. Okay. Sorry, it's almost there. Oh, I went too far. There we go. So this is what we've had a look at. So we've had a look at some of the different methods of communication that we use day to day. You all come up with some very good ones, sign language and speech, etc. We all use a variety of different methods to communicate. And I might have given you a new one there, augmented communication, if you hadn't come across that before, which is like assistive communication. So it's assisting communication with those who have different needs. It could be physical. I gave you the example of Stephen Hawking's, where he's lost his speech, but also with learning difficulties, and things like books of objects of reference can be really helpful to assist develop communication. Some strategies for supporting students have communication. Remember those 4 key words, not big long-winded instructions or sentences, breaking it down to 4 key words and getting rid of all unnecessary grammar, all unnecessary words, joining words like and the, etc., etc. They're not necessary, they're only going to add confusion to your child. Understand the challenges of students who have communication and interaction difficulties, understanding the frustration that can come by it, and not taking it personally, just helping them and understanding as well that it may be 3 steps forward and 1 step back. Eventually, it will happen. As I mentioned, the little chap that I worked with the Henry the Hoover, it took us a long, long time to work out that this could work with the Henry the Hoover, but eventually it did, and there was much frustration along the way between him and us. So keep going, it will get there. Hopefully, I've given you some positive methods to be able to help students with communication and interacting difficulties. I think the objective book of reference, I cannot stress enough how really good and effective that can be if you can get the chance to do it with a child. And we've looked at understanding the impact of our methods for communicating staff can have, that our speech has to be clear. We have to not use too much flowery language when we're trying to communicate, especially when we're trying to communicate with those who already have a communication difficulty. So I'm just now going to go over to some of the questions that you've asked. Sorry, if you just give me a minute to read them through. It seems that nobody has asked any questions. Oh, sorry. There we go. No, I will take it that nobody has any questions, so everything must be quite clear to you. Well, thank you for listening to me talking for a good solid hour. I'm going to hand you back over to our moderator, Georgina, who will tell you what to do. Thank you. Just check.
Hello, I'm back again. Um, don't disappear just yet, because this is the section where you can, if you want to type in any questions and ask Karen anything at this stage, and then you can keep going. Below me as well, there are some files that you can do. So Karen was talking about the objects of reference. You can download that PDF. There's also the ILP on there. If you want to use that with any of your own pupils or anyone that you're working with, you can feel free to share that. And then below that, again, in the files section, there is communication interaction difficulties, PP. So that's the actual PowerPoint that Karen has just been using as well. We've got below that, there are links to a really nice little YouTube clip, which is called Lost in Translation, which you'll find really funny, and it's a really good example of someone who can't communicate very well. And so the final thing is that if you've been participating in this and you didn't sign up through Eventbrite, so if you haven't been receiving all the different emails that we've been sending out, you should have had one an hour before this started, but that just basically means we haven't got your email address. If you don't think we've got your email address, please can you leave that either in a private message, or if you just want to pop it into the chat room, I'll make sure it's not recorded. And then we can send you a certificate of attendance through as well that will give you an hour of CPD that you can add onto your CPD record. Okay, so I'm going to disappear now. I'm going to leave Karen in the room though. So if you want to ask Karen any questions, she'll be here for the next few minutes, or you can just use this opportunity as a chance to chat to each other. Okay, thanks. See you.
Yeah. unmuting my microphone there, I realised I was on mute. Michelle has just asked, are there any specific programs that are really useful? Yes, one that I really like is called SEN Child, in capital letters, and that can be very useful. It's got lots of different programs specifically for children who have special educational needs. There's another very good one called Twinkle or Tickle? Tinkle. SEN Child, that's the one. They're very useful. They're ones that I use, particularly working with SEN children. Also, a good source of lots and lots of resources is TESS. The TESS, the Teachers Educational Supplement, they have a website which is a fabulous source of resources. You have to join it, it doesn't cost anything, but you sign up to it and you can then just access all their resources, and they've got screeds and screeds and screeds of resources for SEN children particularly. So that's my favourites: SEN Child, Twinkle, and TESS. But there are many other ones you can probably find through your schools. Some of the special schools have specials. One I didn't mention, which I'm going to mention now actually because I forgot about it, is Widget, which is a system that translates words into symbols. Anybody who's worked in special schools would have come across this, but it's really useful. It's quite expensive to buy, that's the only problem with it. But some schools are willing to buy, they have to buy a license, and then they get so many sharers for it. So if you had maybe 5 or 6 children in the school who would benefit from it, then it would be worth buying it. But it costs a couple £100, so sometimes schools aren't that willing to buy it. But if you can get them to get it, it's a brilliant system. You can type in any word, just about, and it will come up with a symbol for that word. And you can also make it specific, so you can turn it into, like I was talking about, the objects of reference books. You can use those symbols and adapt them and change them and add photographs, etc., to suit that specific child. So it's very user friendly, but it's also very good for building up vocabulary because of all the symbols relate to individual words. That's one of my favourite ones as well. Hopefully those ones are helpful to you. With the exception of Widget, they're all free. So that's good. Free is good. We like free. Oh, someone has just said they've used Twinkle and it is fantastic. Yeah, it is a useful one. K-Mouse has just asked, is SEN Child for iPad? I don't think it is. I haven't seen it on an iPad yet, but I imagine that, like most of these things, if it's not available on iPads at the moment, I imagine it soon will be. But I haven't personally seen it used on an iPad yet. I've only seen it used on mainframe computers. Not off the top of my head. I'm just being asked, do I know the website for SEN Child, but I can't remember it, I'm sorry. If it comes back to me, I'll email it to Georgina and she can add it onto this list. Ah, Yvonne has just said that it's good that Georgina's typing in the resource names as I'm saying them. That's a good thing, isn't it? Especially things like widget, which you wouldn't necessarily.
I'm very good at that.
She's good at that. She says she's very good typing. Ah. Thank you, David. David says thanks for the session. When is the next one? Sorry? I'm just asking Georgina when the next session is. She's going to take the answer, I think. Yes, she is. 30th of January, there you go. Off the top of my head, Michelle, I can't think of any more examples. But what I will do is I'll create a list and I'll get Georgina to add it on to the web page so that you've got a list of all different sources that I've used in the past that have been useful. Oh, thank you, Lena. Yes, you will be emailed about the next session. I'm just going to get Georgina to respond to that one. She's going to email everybody out the times of the next session. I agree, Georgina. We will get more slick as we get better at this. I definitely have room for improvement. I'm getting the hang of reading and talking at the same time. It's two forms of communication for me. There you go. Georgina said to make sure that you're on the mailing list so that we can get information out to everybody. And Facebook, will it be on Facebook? Is that what it's saying? Ah, sorry, newfangled technology to me. Facebook. And Twitter. Yes, we are on Facebook. What her name is, I'm not sure, but Georgina's typing it as I'm saying it. So she's going to add the link to you. So no, she's not. She is. It's coming. And Twitter. There we go. There is the Twitter contact. So I'm sure that. Oh, and there's Facebook. There you go. Now, I think that Natasha's just asked a question. I think this is the kind of question that probably would be better asked if I asked it out to all of you. So, Natasha, if you don't mind, I'm going to just reiterate your question out to everybody and see what responses we come up with, because this is an interesting one. Natasha says she works with a child who has English as a foreign language but refuses to speak or sit still long enough to interact with the others. So she's tried different methods, I'm assuming. So what have you used that has been successful with a child with English as a foreign language that has helped them? I'm assuming that behaviour might be an issue as well if they refuse to sit down long enough with you. So what have you, those of you out there, have you ever worked with a child who has English as a foreign language? And what strategies have you used? Have you come up with any good ones? Anything that's really been effective? Ah, that's interesting. Michelle has says that she hasn't experience of EAL child, but maybe giving them something to hold on to while you're talking to them. I've seen that done actually, and that can be quite successful, especially if that thing is very important to that child, and it makes them feel secure and it gives them a focus point. So yeah, that might be worth trying, Natasha, giving them something that they want to hold on to. What Yvonne said. She says it just takes time. I agree, it really does take time. She said that it took many, many weeks for him to begin to interact, but yeah, he got there in the end. And Kath has said similar, that it can take a long time to build. You're building up the trust of that child as well, because they're in a foreign country and they don't understand the customs, they don't understand the schooling. Everything is brand new to them. They may be terrified and just might be very, very nervous or traumatized by being taken away from everything they know and put into a place where they don't know anything or understand anything. So giving them time. But I think, who was it that said about using a thing that they're fond of? I think Michelle, yeah, said about giving them a focus point might help. Yeah, give that a try. Ah, that's a good one. Michelle says she's tried whispering. Yes, I think that's a very good one. Lowering your voice to make them listen carefully to you. That can be very effective, because it makes them concentrate if you whisper at them, because they want to know what you're saying, because we're all nosy by nature, aren't we? So yeah, whispering, that's a good tactic, Michelle. I like that. Yeah, and that's also worth remembering, as Yvonne says, that children with EAL, they don't appear to be taking on everything that's going on around them, because they're constantly trying to translate and make sense of everything. But they are actually taking in more than they might be appearing to do. So they're just trying. You have to just give them time. And sometimes you have a child with the EAL, they start off the term with no language at all in English, and then 6 or 7 months they're speaking it almost fluently. So they are taking it in. So don't despair, Natasha. Yeah, that's also worth remembering. They might have an undiagnosed special need. Or it can work the other way. I've got a funny story. I'm going to share it with you. I was working with a young girl a number of years ago who was Portuguese, and had to learn that she was autistic. And we were told that she had absolutely no speech whatsoever, that she was severely autistic and that she had no speech. And this went on for several months. So we were working on developing books of objects of reference with her, etc., to strategies to help a child who had no speech. And one day, a member of staff walked into the classroom and spoke Spanish, and the girl turned around and instantly responded in Spanish back to the girl. And it turned out that she did have speech, it just wasn't English, and nobody had noticed it before. So yes, that, as Michelle says, it can work the other way as well. So you might have a child that, that's why I say you start at the beginning with your child. Don't find out things for yourself. Read carefully all the information that you've been given about that child, but make your own pen picture of that child as well. If I had done my research into that girl, I might have known 6 months previously that she actually did have speech, it just wasn't English. Instead of trying to create a book of objects of reference, instead what we did was we got a translator. It worked really well then after then. Well, we're going to finish now, so thank you everybody for your input into this. It's been really interesting, really helpful. I hope you've enjoyed it, and look forward to seeing you all next time. Bye.